She saved a bear cub and was stunned. The entire bear family surrounded her. The ending brought tears to my eyes. What drives a city woman who has lost everything to flee to the ends of the earth? To a place where the roads end and the silent, indifferent taiga begins. Elena Volkova didn't know the answer. She just drove her SUV on until the asphalt turned to gravel, and the gravel turned into a muddy track leading to the village of Sosnovka. The one her grandfather had spoken so warmly about. The one that was supposed to be her cure. The last kilometer, the car crawled on its belly through the sticky clay after a night of rain. Finally, the wheels spun helplessly, and the engine stalled. Silence. Thick, ringing, oppressive. Elena banged her fist on the steering wheel. Even here, thousands of kilometers from her former life, everything was going wrong. The door opened with a strained creak. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, wild and unfamiliar. 100 meters ahead, several houses blackened by time were visible. Her new home. Or rather, her grandfather's old house. Before we continue, let us know what city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. She hadn't taken 10 steps when a figure emerged from behind a crooked pine tree on the side of the road. A man, skinny, wearing an old canvas jacket with a face like tree bark. He didn't approach her, just stood there and stared. His piercing eyes were heavy and appraising. Elena felt uncomfortable, like a city sparrow caught in the sights of a hawk. She nodded in greeting. The man barely nodded back. "Stuck, city girl?" His voice was hoarse, matching his appearance. "A little," Elena replied, trying to sound calm. "This isn't a boulevard. Here you have to think about where you're going." He snapped, and without waiting for a reply, turned and walked toward the village. Elena watched him go. So much for her first encounter. Stepan Matveyevich Kluev, her grandfather's friend. Her grandfather had described him as the most reliable man in the taiga. Now he just seemed like a grumpy old man to her. She sighed, picked up her backpack, and walked toward the house, dragging her feet across the soggy ground. The house greeted her with the smell of dust and a cold stove. There were cobwebs in the corners and faded photographs on the walls. In one of them, her young grandfather stood embracing an equally young Stepan. Both were smiling. Elena felt an unbearable longing. Why was she here? What was she running from? From an empty apartment where every corner reminded her of betrayal? Or from herself? For the next few days, Alyona sorted through her belongings, trying to make the space her own. She forced herself to get up at dawn, carried water from the well, and chopped wood. Physical exhaustion helped her not to think. On the third day, she picked up what was both her passion and her curse, her camera. She left the village and walked along the Bystraya River. The water rushed by at a furious pace, crashing against boulders and foaming over the rapids. Elena walked cautiously, listening to the sounds of the forest. A rustle in the bushes, the cry of an unfamiliar bird, the crack of a dry branch. Everything here was alive. She felt hundreds of invisible eyes on her. Her grandfather had taught her to read tracks, and now she saw them. A huge paw print with 5 long claws, and next to it, several smaller tracks. A female bear with her cubs. Her heart began to beat faster. It wasn't fear, but the excitement of a photographer. This was her chance, to take a picture that would give her meaning back. Stepan, meeting her in the evening at the well, glanced at her dirty boots. "I've been out far?" he asked without much interest. "Along the river. I saw some tracks. Bear tracks. Elena replied proudly. Stepan's face darkened. This isn't the zoo. A female bear with cubs is the most dangerous animal there is. You think she'll pose for you? Get out of there while you're still in one piece. He spat on the ground and left, leaving Elena with mixed feelings. Irritation fought with the fear that was beginning to grow. She didn't listen to him. Every morning she went into the forest, exercising extreme caution. She found a place where the bear family often came to drink water. She hid in the thick undergrowth on the other bank and waited. For hours, for days, and one day, her patience was rewarded. She stepped onto the pebble beach, the mistress of the taiga, huge, brown, powerful, and behind her, tumbling and jostling, came two funny, shaggy lumps. Elena held her breath. The clicks of the camera shutter seemed deafening in the silence. The mother bear was teaching her cubs to fish. One of them, the most curious, clumsily slapped the water with its paw, causing fountains of spray. Elena smiled as she looked through the lens. She felt her soul thaw. This picture of a perfect, untouched family was balm for her wounds. She took pictures, forgetting everything else, until the sun began to set. That evening, for the first time in a long time, she felt something like happiness. She was sure she was doing everything right. She didn't know that the sky in the west was already gathering leaden clouds, and that this idyll was just the calm before the storm. The storm came suddenly. At night, the sky split with a deafening flash, and a downpour fell on the ground. It wasn't rain, but a solid wall of water. The wind howled in the chimney like a wounded animal. Elena sat by the window, watching the raging elements. The Bystraya River, already capricious, turned into a roaring torrent that broke bushes and uprooted young trees. By morning, the downpour had subsided a little, but the river had swollen to incredible proportions, carrying with it uprooted snags and debris. Elena paced restlessly around the house. She was drawn to the place where she had been filming. What had happened to the bear family? Had they managed to find shelter? Putting on a waterproof raincoat, she headed for the river, ignoring common sense. The sight was terrifying. A muddy brown stream rushed by at incredible speed. And suddenly, through the roar of the water, she heard a thin, plaintive squeak. It came from somewhere in the middle of the river. Elena strained her eyes. A huge piece of driftwood was caught in the middle of the stream, creating a small island in the raging water. And on this log, clinging to it with all four paws, sat a tiny, wet ball. A bear cub, the same curious one. He was being swept away by the current, struggling desperately, but his strength was failing. There was no sign of his mother. A second bear cub was rushing about on the bank, but was afraid to approach the water. Stepan's words flashed through Elena's mind. This isn't a zoo. But she looked at the helpless creature that was about to die and realized she couldn't just stand there and watch. She acted almost without thinking, purely on instinct. Throwing off her heavy coat, she entered the icy water. The current immediately knocked her off her feet. She surfaced, spitting, and moved forward again, clinging to the bottom, to the rocks. Every step was a battle. The water pulled, beat, tried to drag her to the bottom. The cold numbed her muscles. She saw only one goal, the log with the desperately squealing bear cub. She no longer felt fear or cold, only a burning desire to get there, to make it in time. The log was very close now. She reached out her hand. The bear cub, seeing her, hissed, baring its tiny teeth. "Quiet, little one, quiet. I want to help you," whispered Elena, and there was no fear in her voice. She grabbed him by the scruff of his neck, as cats and bears do, and pulled him toward her with all her strength. He was heavier than he looked. Now she had to get back. The way back was even scarier. With one hand, she held the whimpering, trembling animal close to her, and with the other, she tried to paddle, fighting the current. Her strength was leaving her. She had almost reached the shore when her foot slipped off a rock. She went under with her head, but with her last ounce of strength, she pushed the bear cub forward into the shallows. Once on shore, she lay on the wet pebbles, unable to move, gasping for air. The bear cub crawled away from her and shook all over. Elena rolled onto her back and tried to catch her breath. At that moment, she felt the air become heavy. There was a loud, threatening crack from the coastal thickets of willow bushes. Elena slowly turned her head. She emerged from the bushes, breaking branches. A female bear. She was huge, twice as big as she had appeared through the lens. Her wet fur stood on end, making her look even more massive. She was staring straight at Elena. There was nothing in her small black eyes but cold, primal rage. The bear took a step forward and let out a low, rumbling growl that made Elena's blood run cold. The rescued cub squealed and rushed to its mother. She sniffed it, then stared at the human again. Elena froze. She lay on the ground, wet, exhausted, completely defenseless. She knew it was the end. One jump, one blow with a paw, and it would all be over. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But there was no blow. A second passed, then another. Silence. Only the roar of the river and the beating of her own heart. Elena forced herself to open her eyes. The bear stood in the same place. She was looking at her. Long, intently. It was not the gaze of a predator assessing its prey. It was something else. Something Elena could not understand. Then the bear made another sound. It was not like a growl at all. It was short and guttural. She turned around, nudged both cubs with her nose, and without looking back, disappeared into the taiga. Elena was left alone, trembling all over, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She had survived. But why? She did not know that this encounter would change not only her life, but also the laws by which the taiga itself lived. The next morning, still weak and exhausted, she opened the door of her hut and froze. On the porch, right at the threshold, lay a large, silvery fish. Its gills were still moving slightly. There was not a single human footprint on the damp ground, only a few huge, deep bear paw prints. Elena stood on the porch, unable to take her eyes off the silvery body of the fish. The cold morning air burned her lungs, but she didn't feel it. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. Slowly, as if afraid of scaring away a ghost, she dropped to her knees. She touched the wet, elastic scales with her fingertips. Real. Next to it, on the dew-covered wood, there were clear prints. Huge, with deep gouges from claws. Not dog or human. She picked up the fish. It was heavy, about 3 kilograms. A grayling, the king of fish in these parts. Elena carried it into the house and laid it on the table, continuing to stare at it as if it were an alien from another planet. Gratitude? Impossible. Animals don't think in such categories. It's instinct, territory, survival. That's what her grandfather said. That's what Stepan insisted. That's what her own common sense told her. But the tracks didn't lie. She couldn't settle down all day. The camera lay unused. All her thoughts revolved around her morning discovery. She tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the bear had simply abandoned its prey, frightened by something. But why right at her doorstep? Maybe it was someone's cruel joke. But who in this village of 3 houses would play such a sophisticated joke? There was only one answer, and it was frightening in its unreality. By evening, unable to bear it any longer, she went to Stepan. He was sitting on the porch, cleaning an old rifle. His movements were slow, honed by years of practice. He looked up at Elena with his sharp eyes and asked nothing, just waited. "Stepan Matveyevitch," she began, stammering. "This morning, on the porch, there was a fish lying there." Stepan grunted, not looking up from his work. "Well, it happens. A crow dropped it. It weighed 3 kilograms, and there were tracks around it, bear tracks," Elena blurted out. Stepan's hands froze for a moment. He slowly raised his head. His gaze was filled with disbelief mixed with irritation. "Listen, city girl. Stop making up fairy tales. You almost drowned yesterday. Your head is clouded. Some stray dog dragged a carcass to you, and you've already imagined yourself friends with a bear. That beast isn't a stuffed toy. It'll eat you and not even choke. Forget it, and don't go near the river again." He spoke harshly, curtly. He was trying to drive the dangerous delusion out of her head. But Elena saw what she saw. "But the tracks," she repeated stubbornly. "There are lots of tracks in the taiga." Stepan snapped. "Go home, Elena, and lock the door tight at night." He demonstratively returned to cleaning his gun, making it clear that the conversation was over. Elena left, feeling like a complete fool. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just her imagination, exhausted by stress. But the next morning, there was a new gift on the porch. This time it was a large piece of wild honey in a honeycomb, neatly placed on a broad burdock leaf. It gave off the tart, heady scent of the taiga. And again, the same footprints were nearby. Elena sat down on the steps and laughed. A quiet, hysterical laugh. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was really happening. She grabbed her camera. This time she didn't go into the forest. She stayed at home. She photographed everything. The honeycomb on the porch, the clear footprints on the ground, her own reflection in the dark window pane. The face of a woman who had encountered a miracle. That day, she realized that her mission had changed. She was no longer just a photographer hunting for a beautiful shot. She had become a witness, a keeper of an incredible secret. She started a diary, describing every day in detail, every discovery, every thought. The gifts did not appear every day. Sometimes 2 or 3 days would pass, and she would begin to think that it was all over. But then a bundle of dried mushrooms would appear on her doorstep, or a handful of ripe forest berries that she didn't even know the name of. She never saw the bear herself. The gifts appeared in the pre-dawn twilight, silently and unnoticed. But Elena felt her presence. She knew she was being watched, and there was no longer any threat in this observation. There was something else, some kind of primitive, silent communication. Stepan also noticed the changes. He saw how Elena stopped being afraid, how her gait became more confident. She no longer came to him with stories about bears. She began to talk less and listen more. She listened to the forest. Early one morning, as he was walking to the river, he saw her. She was standing on her porch, looking at something at her feet. Stepan hid behind an old bathhouse. He saw her pick something up from the ground and take it into the house. When she disappeared inside, he cautiously approached. On the damp ground, where Elena had just been standing, he saw them, fresh, clear footprints, and he realized that she hadn't been lying. The old hunter stood and looked at those footprints, and his world, so clear and predictable, was shaken. He didn't say anything to Elena, but from that day on, his gaze changed. There was no longer any mockery in it. A wary curiosity appeared. He began to watch her and the forest, trying to understand something that did not fit into any of the laws of the taiga. Another week passed. Elena grew bolder. She began to go back to her hiding place by the river. But now it was not for the photographs. She just wanted to see them. And they came. The female bear looked calm. The cubs had grown noticeably and become even more playful. Elena looked at them, and her heart was warm. She felt like she was part of this world, part of this family. She was so absorbed in the spectacle that she almost missed a detail that disrupted the harmony. On the other side of the river, a little way from the bear's beach, something was wrong. She focused her camera, zooming in as far as it would go. On the trunk of a mighty pine tree, right at eye level, she could see a fresh notch. It was a deep, slanted cut that had stripped the bark down to the wood. A mark. That's what her grandfather called the marks hunters left in the forest. But this mark was different. It was too fresh, too obvious. It wasn't a landmark. It was a target mark. Eleona's heart skipped a beat. She moved the lens slightly lower and scanned the ground at the foot of the pine tree. And she saw something that sent a chill down her spine. Brass glinted dimly in the grass. An empty rifle cartridge case. Someone had been here, very recently. Someone with a powerful weapon. And he had also been watching this family. But his intentions were very different. Elena lowered her camera. The idol was shattered in an instant. Her secret, magical world was under attack. Somewhere out there, in the green thicket, lurked a ruthless, calculating threat. And this threat now knew where to find the most trusting and unusual bear family in the entire taiga. Suddenly, the silence of the forest was pierced by a distant but distinct sound that made the blood run cold. It was not the roar of an animal or the cry of a bird. It was the strained, intermittent rumble of an engine, a quad bike engine, there where no road led. The sound of the engine was alien and piercing. It cut through the pristine silence of the taiga like a rusty knife through silk. Elena pressed herself into the bushes, her heart pounding in her throat. She saw the female bear tense up. She raised her head and sniffed, catching the unfamiliar smell of gasoline exhaust. Growling low, she quickly led her cubs deeper into the thicket. The sound of the ATV passed somewhere off to the side, behind a wall of trees, and gradually faded away. But its echo lingered in the air for a long time, poisoning it. Elena no longer thought about the photos. She frantically scrolled through the images on her camera until she found the ones she needed. A clear image of the notch in the pine tree, a close-up of the dull, shiny shell casing. These were clues, evidence. She jumped out of her hiding place and, without looking where she was going, started running. Not to her home, to Stepan. She flew into his yard, gasping for breath, unable to utter a word. She just handed him the camera. Stepan took the camera from her trembling hands. His gaze slid across the screen. He silently enlarged one photo, then another. His face seemed to freeze. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened. "So," he exhaled briefly, returning the camera to her. "This is bad. What is it? Who are they?" Elena finally found her voice. "They're not hunters. Hunters respect the animal. These are butchers," he said through clenched teeth. He picked up the shell casing she had picked up and brought to him in her pocket. He turned it over in his calloused fingers. 762. Tiger, or Saiga. A serious machine. It shoots far and kills instantly. He nodded at the photo with the mark. "And this notch is a mark. It means they're following her. They tracked her down, studied her habits. They're waiting for the right moment." "But why? Why do they want this family?" Elena's voice rang with despair. Stepan looked at her with a heavy, piercing gaze. You're a city girl, you wouldn't understand. A big bear is a trophy, a pelt and bile. They pay crazy money for it on the black market. And by feeding her with your photo shoots and your friendship, you've made her an easy target. The last words hit Elena like a slap in the face. What do you mean? She's gotten used to you. She's let her guard down. She goes out into the open, to the river, at the same time every day. She's become predictable. And for those bastards, a predictable animal is a dead animal. Elena sat down on a bench. Guilt weighed heavily on her. She wanted to save her, to help her. But instead she had signed her death warrant. She thought she had found a miracle, but in fact she had created the perfect conditions for murder. At that moment, the roar of an engine came again, from the forest road leading to the village. This time it didn't fade away, but grew louder and louder. A minute later, a well-used quad bike rolled into the lane leading to Stepan's house. It was dirty, with empty canisters strapped to the back. There were 2 men on it. The one behind the wheel was about 40, with cold, colorless eyes and a thin, evil smile on his weather-beaten lips. The second, the passenger, was younger, massive, with a bull neck and a dull, inscrutable expression on his face. They were dressed in expensive camouflage, but it was splattered with mud and looked worn. They stopped a few meters from the porch. The one behind the wheel turned off the engine. "Hi, Father," he said to Stepan. His voice was calm, even polite, but there was a chill in his politeness. "And you don't get sick," Stepan muttered, not letting go of the rifle, which he continued to wipe with a rag. "We're tourists. Your place is beautiful, wild," the stranger continued, his gaze sliding over Elena, lingering on her expensive camera, and then returning to Stepan. "They say there's a lot of wild animals. Have you seen any bears?" Stepan slowly raised his head. "There are all kinds of animals, for those who come with good intentions." "We come with good intentions," smiled the visitor. "We have a license for antlered game, just curious. Maybe you can tell us where to look for fresher tracks." His gaze was sharp as a needle. He wasn't just asking, he was scanning, assessing, looking for the slightest weakness. "The taiga is big. It will tell you who you need to talk to," Stepan replied vaguely. He stood motionless, like a granite rock, and Elena could feel the tension emanating from the old hunter. "I see," the stranger said slowly. His smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "You're a man of few words, Father. Well, goodbye." He started the engine, and the quad bike roared off around the bend, leaving behind a pungent smell of exhaust and an oppressive feeling of unease. Elena exhaled, realizing she hadn't been breathing the whole time. "Who was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Stepan replied slowly, his gaze fixed on the spot where the ATV had just been. "But they're not tourists, and they don't have a license." He silently walked around his house, carefully examining the ground. Elena followed him, not understanding what he was looking for. At the woodpile, where the logs were neatly stacked under a canopy, Stepan stopped abruptly. He bent down and picked up something small and black from the ground. He turned it over in his fingers and held it out to Elena on his open palm. It was a small plastic box, about the size of a matchbox, with a tiny antenna. "What is it?" she asked, confused. "They left a little gift?" Stepan said grimly. His face grew even more stern. "A GPS tracker. A tracker. They weren't just asking questions. They're marking their territory." The only question is, why did they leave it here? At my house? Alyona looked at the beacon in her palm, then at Stepan. A terrible thought struck her. They weren't just looking for a bear. They were following them. They knew or suspected that the locals knew something. And they had just turned this quiet, sleepy village into the center of their hunt. The threat was no longer out there in the forest. It was here, close by, and it was smart, technologically advanced, and completely ruthless. Stepan clenched his fists. Now it's personal, he growled. They broke the law, my law. A cold fire flashed in his eyes, and Elena realized that the grumpy old man she had met on her first day was gone. Standing before her was a taiga hunter, ready to defend his home to the last. But she also understood that there were only two of them, against armed, trained professionals. And they didn't even know where the enemy would strike next. Night fell on Sosnovka like a thick, ink-black veil. Elena sat in her grandfather's house, locking the door with all the bolts. She felt like she was in a besieged fortress. Every rustle outside the window, every creak of the old floorboards made her flinch. She replayed her encounter with the tourists over and over again in her head. Their cold eyes, their fake politeness, the beacon they left behind. These weren't just amateur poachers. They were predators, methodical and calculating. She went to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The light was on in Stepan's house. She could see his dark silhouette passing by the window. He wasn't asleep. He was getting ready too. For what? She didn't know, and that frightened her even more. Stepan wasn't idle at that moment. He was sitting at the table, methodically laying out a 2-kilometer map on an old oilcloth. It wasn't a tourist map, but a detailed one, covered with his own notes made over decades of living in the taiga. He was thinking. The beacon left at his house wouldn't let him rest. It was either a terrible mistake or a bold, calculated move. They could just be watching the village, waiting for someone to lead them to the beast. Or they could be planning something much worse. He walked over to an old chest that he hadn't opened in years. The lock creaked. Inside, wrapped in an oil-soaked rag, lay his old SKS hunting rifle. Not as powerful as the poacher's tiger, but as reliable as his own hand. He was not a killer, but he was a protector. And now he felt that he would have to defend more than just the beast. At dawn, when the fog was still clinging to the tops of the pine trees, Elena heard a soft knock on the door. She jumped up. Stepan was standing in the doorway. He was wearing his old canvas jacket, with a thin backpack slung over his shoulder. He was holding a carbine in his hands. "Get ready," he said curtly. "Quickly. Take only the essentials. The camera, water, something to eat. And dress warmly, the nights are cold." "Where are we going?" Elena asked, confused. "We're leaving. We'll wait in the forest. It's dangerous to stay here. They know we know. And they'll be back. But first we have to do one thing." He led her not toward the river, but in the opposite direction, deeper into the forest, along a barely visible path. They walked in silence for about an hour. Stepan moved silently, like a shadow, and Elena tried not to fall behind. Finally, he stopped at the foot of an old, spreading spruce tree. "Wait here, and don't stick your head out," he ordered, and disappeared into the thicket. Elena was left alone. The silence was deafening. She sat down on a fallen tree, clutching the camera tightly in her hands. 20 minutes passed, which seemed like an eternity to her. Suddenly, from the direction Stepan had gone, there was a piercing, plaintive squeal. It sounded like the cry of a wounded hare or fox. The cry was repeated, then again, and then fell silent. Elena jumped up. What had happened? Was he in trouble? She was about to rush to his aid, but then he appeared from behind the trees, calm as ever. What was that? She gasped. A decoy, Stepan replied briefly, hiding a small wooden whistle in his pocket. I was luring it. Now let's go, quickly. They set off again, but now completely off the trail, going deeper and deeper into the taiga. After a couple of hours, Stepan led her to a small clearing with a tiny winter hut built into the ground. It was an old hunter's hut that only a few people knew about. No one will look for us here, he said, opening the creaky door. Inside, it was dry and smelled of smoke. There were plank beds, a small cast-iron stove, and a table. Elena collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. Only now did she realize how tired she was. Stepan Matveyevich, why were you shouting into the bird call? Who were you trying to lure? She asked. Stepan laid a loaf of bread and a piece of bacon on the table. Them, the ones on the quad bike. I left them a trail, a false one. They'll hear the bird call and think it's a young bird, easy prey. They'll follow my tracks, and the tracks will lead them to the old bear trap I set up along the road. Elena froze. You want to kill them? Stepan looked at her as if she had said something incredibly stupid. No, I want to scare them, delay them, buy some time. The trap is old and rusty. It won't break a leg, but it will tear a pant leg and make a lot of noise. While they're fussing with it, we'll get even further away, and they'll realize they're not welcome here. He spoke simply and matter-of-factly, but behind his words lay cold, taiga logic. He wasn't playing games. He was waging his own war, a war for his world. The night in the winter hut was restless. Elena hardly slept. She thought she could hear every sound outside. Stepan sat by the barely smoldering stove, his rifle on his knees, staring into the fire. His face was inscrutable. What was he thinking about? The past, the future, or the fact that somewhere out there in the darkness, there were people who had come to kill? In the morning, they moved on. Stepan led her through places where it seemed that no human foot had ever trod. They waded through icy streams and fought their way through impenetrable windbreaks. By noon, they came to a small forest lake, hidden among the rocks. The water was dark and still. We can find her here, Stepan said, looking around the shore. Who? The bear. When the forest is restless, she takes her cubs to the most secluded places, far from the river, far from people. They found tracks, fresh ones. The she-bear was indeed somewhere here. They settled in a crevice between the rocks, from where they could see most of the shore. They had to warn her. But how? How could they tell a wild animal that it was in mortal danger? They waited for several hours. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky crimson when they appeared. The she-bear came out onto the shore, looking around cautiously. The cubs immediately rushed to the water. They looked frightened, huddling close to their mother. Apparently, the noise in the forest and the chase had frightened them too. Elena raised her camera, but not to take a picture. She looked through the lens as if through binoculars. Suddenly she froze, her fingers turning white as she clutched the camera. Stepan Matveyevich. Look, she whispered. Stepan put his old, worn binoculars to his eyes. Around the neck of one of the cubs, the one Elena had saved, there was something unnatural. A black, wide collar, and on it, a tiny red light was flashing. It wasn't a beacon left at home. It was something else, much more powerful, aimed directly at its target. They weren't marking their territory. They were marking their prey. And now they knew her every move. Now she had nowhere to hide. The trap had snapped shut. The red light on the bear cub's neck pulsed like a vicious, poisonous insect. It was turning a wild, free creature into a dot on a navigator's screen. Elena lowered her camera, feeling nausea rising in her throat. All this time, while she was admiring the gifts and believing in a miracle, they were working. Cold-blooded, calculating, technologically advanced. While she was rescuing the bear cub from the river, they were probably already watching her, waiting for the right moment. "How?" she whispered, looking at Stepan. "How could they do that?" Stepan didn't take his binoculars away from the bear family. His face looked like a mask made of gray stone. "An arrow, with a sleeping pill," he replied hoarsely. "A special one, with a low dose. They put the cub to sleep while its mother was fishing. They put this junk on him and left. She didn't even realize what had happened. She found him sleeping and thought he was tired." There was no surprise in his voice, only cold, compressed rage. He had seen this before. He had seen what people were capable of for profit. Now everything fell into place. The notch in the tree, the shell casing, the visit to the village, the beacon at his house. It was an operation, planned down to the last detail. They didn't just want to kill the bear. They wanted to do it for sure, without any extra effort. They waited until the she-bear led them to her winter den. Killing a sleeping animal. What could be easier? And then, with the collar on the cub, they could find her anywhere. The mother bear on the shore was acting restless. She kept looking around, sniffing. She sensed that something was wrong, but couldn't figure out where the threat was coming from. The cub with the collar didn't seem to notice the foreign object. He tried to play with his brother, but for some reason, his brother shunned him. Perhaps the collar was giving off an unfamiliar, foreign smell. "We have to take it off," Elena said firmly. It was not a request, but a statement. She was to blame for the animal's loss of caution, and she had to fix it. Stepan lowered his binoculars and looked at her. For the first time ever, he saw not confusion and fear in her eyes, but steely determination. The same determination he felt himself. "It's impossible," he said sharply. "If you go near them, she'll tear you to pieces. She's on edge right now. She won't be able to tell friend from foe. But we have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come and kill them all." Elena's voice rang with tears. Stepan was silent. He looked at the lake, at the rocks, at the darkening sky. The old hunter considered his options. Each one was bad. They couldn't leave and abandon the animal to be torn apart. They couldn't engage in open combat with the poachers. The odds were too great. There was only one option left. They had to act first. Play by their rules, but faster and smarter. "There is one way," he finally said, and Elena shuddered at his voice. It had become quiet and harsh, like the crunch of snow in the bitter cold. "But it's very dangerous, and if we go through with it, there will be no turning back." He told her his plan. It was desperate and daring. They had to lure the poachers into a trap, to a place that Stepan knew like the back of his hand, a place where technology was useless and knowledge of the taiga was everything. "The Devil's Canyon," he called it. A deep, narrow gorge with sheer walls and a boggy bottom, a real death trap where even the most desperate hunters didn't venture. The poachers, following the signal from the beacon, didn't know the area. They would take the shortest route that the navigator showed them, straight into the trap. "But how are we going to lure the bear there?" Elena asked. "That," Stepan looked her straight in the eye, "is your job." She trusts you. She listens to you. You're the only one who can get close enough to her. The plan was insane. Elena had to go out to the bear. Alone. Without a weapon. And somehow get her to follow her in the right direction, away from danger and into a trap for their pursuers. It was suicide. But there was no other way. They waited until the bear family disappeared into the rocks for the night. Then, under cover of darkness, they began to act. Stepan went to set the trap in Devil's Canyon. Elena, taking her camera and a small bag with the remains of honey that the bear had once brought her, went to their lair. She walked, guided by the stars and her sense of smell. She felt almost no fear. It was replaced by a burning sense of duty. She found them in a deep crevice, sheltered from the wind. The cubs were sleeping, huddled together. The mother bear was dozing, but alert. When Elena approached, she raised her head. A low, warning growl sounded. Elena froze. She slowly, so as not to make any sudden movements, lowered herself to the ground and placed the bag of honey in front of her. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, even though she knew the beast wouldn't understand her words. But it would understand her tone. She spoke softly, calmly, as she would to a frightened child. The bear stared at her, motionless. Her black eyes seemed bottomless in the dim light. Elena slowly, inch by inch, pushed the honey toward her. "This is for you. Remember?" She didn't know if it would work, but she had one last trump card, the incredible, impossible bond that had formed between them. The bear sniffed the air. She caught the familiar scent. She slowly got up. She took a step toward Elena, then another. She was so close that Elena could feel her hot breath. The huge head tilted, and the bear gently took the bag with her lips. She didn't eat it. She just held it, looking at Elena. And at that moment, Elena understood. She understood. She understood everything. Elena slowly got up, and without looking back, she walked away. Toward Devil's Canyon. She took 10 steps, 15. Her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. She didn't know if the bear would follow her. But when she stopped and turned around, she saw a huge bear emerge from the crevice, like a silent shadow. She woke up her cubs and, nudging them with her nose, followed Elena. A few dozen kilometers away, at his temporary camp, the same poacher with cold eyes stared at his laptop screen. The dot on the map marking their target was moving slowly but surely. "She's awake, Beauty," he grinned, turning to his partner. "She's coming, right on schedule." He zoomed in on the map. The animal's route was strange. It led toward some old, abandoned rock quarries. "Look, she's decided to change her location. She's leading us into some kind of hole." His partner, a burly, muscular man, shrugged. "What does it matter? The main thing is that we have a signal. We'll get there and take it." "Yes," agreed the senior officer, closing his laptop. "We'll get there and take it." He was absolutely confident in his technology, his weapons, and his righteousness. He didn't know that the dot on his map wasn't just a target. It was a decoy. And it was leading him not to a trophy, but to the very center of a trap set for them by an old taiga dweller who knew every rock and every tree in this forest. The final battle was inevitable. They walked all night. Elena led the way, the she-bear and her cubs following at a respectful distance. It was a strange, unimaginable caravan, a human and wild animals united by a common goal: to survive. By dawn, they reached the entrance to Devil's Canyon. It was a gloomy place, a narrow gap between two giant rocks, with a stream running along the bottom, turning the ground into sticky, squelching mud. Stepan was waiting for them. Without a word, he pointed to a narrow ledge leading up to the canyon wall. "There's a cave there. Sit quietly and don't stick your head out, no matter what happens," he ordered. Elena looked at the bear. "What about her?" "She'll do what she has to do," Stepan replied mysteriously. He threw several pieces of fish he had caught in the lake into the bottom of the canyon. The smell attracted the female bear. She hesitated, then entered the narrow gorge. The cubs followed her. Elena climbed onto a ledge and hid in a small cave. From there, she could see most of the canyon. She saw Stepan, like a ghost, disappear into a crevice on the opposite wall. The trap was ready. They didn't have to wait long. An hour later, they heard the roar of a quad bike. It stopped at the entrance to the canyon. Two men appeared. They looked doubtfully at the gloomy gorge. "Are you sure this is the place?" asked the younger one. "The navigator says they're here, somewhere within 100 meters, replied the older one. He took out a small device that looked like a radar with a directional antenna. "The signal is clear. They're inside." They left the ATV and, keeping their carbines at the ready, entered the canyon. They walked slowly and cautiously, placing their feet on the firmer ground. They passed the cave where Elena was hiding without noticing her. They had almost reached the place where the she-bear was feeding her cubs when it happened. From above, a huge boulder broke away from the canyon wall. It crashed to the bottom with a loud bang, blocking their way back. The poachers jumped back. "What the hell?" shouted the younger one, raising his rifle. At that moment, there was a crack from the other side, and a huge dry tree fell onto the path, which Stepan had cut down, blocking their way forward. They found themselves in a stone bag. "We're trapped," the younger one shouted in panic. "Quiet," barked the older one. He realized it was a trap, and at that very moment, a roar came from around the bend in the gorge. It was not a growl, but a deafening roar of rage from a mother defending her children. A huge brown fury was rushing toward them, a she-bear. She realized she was cornered, and her only instinct was to attack. The older poacher managed to fire. The bullet whistled, hitting a rock near the beast's head. He tried to aim again, but at that moment, Stepan jumped from the canyon wall, right at him. He hit him on the hands with the butt of his old carbine, and the weapon flew into the mud. The younger poacher fired into the air in terror, trying to scare the bear away, but she was already close. Elena watched all this with her heart in her throat. She saw Stepan fighting the chief poacher. She saw the younger one drop his weapon and try to climb up the sheer wall to escape the bear. And then she made a decision. She jumped out of the cave and screamed. "No, back!" She wasn't screaming at the men. She was screaming at the bear. The beast froze for a moment. She recognized the voice. That split-second pause saved the hapless poacher's life. He managed to climb several meters up, out of reach of her paws. Below, Stepan had already wrestled the older man to the ground, who, without his weapon, was not so formidable after all. It was all over. A few hours later, when the inspector whom Stepan had called on his satellite phone arrived, the poachers were already tied up. Stepan silently approached Elena. "You saved his life," he said, nodding toward the guy shaking on the rock. "I didn't save him," Elena replied quietly. "I saved her. From another murder." When everything had calmed down and the poachers had been taken away, Stepan and Alyona returned to the lake. The female bear was there. She had calmed down and was licking her cubs. Stepan took a small noose made of rope on a long stick out of his backpack. "One last thing," he said. He walked to the water and threw in the few remaining fish. The cub with the collar, the most curious one, ran to the water's edge. At that moment, Stepan, with agility incredible for his age, threw the noose around its neck and pulled sharply. The cub let out a squeal. The mother bear jumped up, ready to pounce. "Elena!" Stepan shouted. Elena ran forward, standing between Stepan and the mother bear. "Quiet, quiet, my dear. Everything's fine," she said, holding out her arms. The bear stopped. She growled, but did not attack. She could see that Elena was not afraid, and that held her back. At that moment, Stepan used a special pair of pliers to cut through the plastic collar in a matter of seconds and release the cub. It immediately rushed to its mother. They stood facing each other, two people and a family of bears. The threat was over. The collar lay in the mud. Stepan and Elena slowly began to back away without turning their backs. The she-bear watched them. When they were far away, she made that same quiet, guttural sound, a sound that Elena already knew. It was a farewell and gratitude. Elena turned around. She watched as the huge bear, nudging her cubs, disappeared into the depths of the taiga. The rescued cub stopped for a second and looked straight at her. There was something meaningful in its childlike gaze. Elena couldn't hold back and began to cry. They were tears of relief, sadness, and happiness all at once. She realized that by saving this little animal, she had saved herself. She had found what she was looking for. Not just a beautiful photo, but a new meaning in life, a new self. She knew that she would never be the same again. This story would stay with her forever as the most important lesson taught to her by the wild but fair Siberian taiga. Do you think Elena did the right thing by intervening at the last moment to save the poacher's life, or should she have let nature take its course?